Great. So welcome to everybody. This is what will assembly webinar, taking a look at the forthcoming COP, which, as we all know, starts on Sunday. But we're looking at it from a sort of a non-climate perspective, looking at how does COP affect and what impact and what do groups need from COP on issues that are related to COP, because everything's affected, but looking at education, rights, and health primarily. And there's also lots of other issues, as you know, but these are the three ones that we have some speakers speaking with today. And I'm really pleased to say that Sarah Miller from CECG is with us today. She has her finger on the pulse of the climate negotiations, as well as the climate ask. And she's going to give us a roundup of what are the key climate asks. What do we need from the climate perspective over COP over the next 2 weeks? And then give us a bit of an update where we think, or where she thinks the state of negotiations are. And then we're going to have Anya from UNICEF, who will speak on education and what says key asks from an education perspective. And I think she's been speaking particularly from the youth perspective. We then have Melanie, who's going to, from Global Health Advocates, who's going to speak on health and how health affects, climate affects health, as we know. And then we have Chiara, who hopefully will be joining us shortly. I think she's been held up, will be speaking on rights from Amnesty International. Then we'll open for Q&A, ask some questions or share some other points, and then we'll wrap up within the hour. Trying to make sure that we did make best use of everyone's time, because I know everyone's extremely busy given G20 on the weekend and then COP kicking off. So without further ado, I think I'll hand over to Sarah to kick us off and give us an update on, what do we need from COP in terms of climate and where are we at in terms of the negotiations. So Sarah, can I hand over to you?
Yes, please, Kel. Thank you. And thank you for having me. Delighted to give you a real quick tour de force of what's happening in the next couple of weeks. So Kel, I hope you've got my presentation there ready to go.
I'm going to share my screen now. This is why I always get the wrong one.
It's only a few slides, so it's not going to be death by PowerPoint. But I'm very happy, Kel, if you want to share these afterwards. So if you could bob down to the next slide. So I just wanted to let you know, first part of the presentation, COP expectations, and then second part of the presentation is like the cadence of the 2 weeks, just so you know what the rhythm is going to be and sort of the different, I will call them theatrical points during the fortnight, because that's a good way to describe them. So if you go to the next slide, please, Cal. So this is a bit of a word salad. We haven't had a COP for 2 years, so there's a lot being sort of shoehorned into this one meeting. I will say that the expectations are, the mood music going in, it's really tough. The geopolitics is bad, COVID is bad, access to the COP has been bad, Global South participants getting there has been bad. Like, everybody is just really grumpy, everybody is in a bad mood. Global solidarity, multilateralism, it's all at a really low ebb. So the surround sound, the mood music really couldn't be much worse, to be quite honest. I'm sure it could, and I'm tempting fate when I say things like that, but like I said, we haven't had a COP for 2 years, and in the meantime, we've had climate impacts all around the world. Like, no part of the world has been unaffected by whether it's floods, drought, climate induced famine in Madagascar. We've had the IPCC Code Red report earlier in the autumn. Lots of commentators talk about the era of loss and damage. So this is moving beyond adaptation. This is climate losses that cannot be adapted to. This is climate loss that cannot be bought back with some amount of money or some mechanism. So it's not great. The other thing to point out about a COP and the expectations is for a COP is it's about the whole package, and a lot of campaigners, a lot of organisations will focus on one specific thing. So, a group might focus on loss and damage, or a group might focus on climate finance, or a group might focus on 1.5. And for those in the negotiations, things are traded in the room at the end. And quite often it can incense the campaigners so that there is a verdict of, well, we didn't get that on, my issue or my organisation's issue, therefore the whole thing is a failure. But the negotiators themselves and the countries and the parties will look at the whole package and then add on to that. I should have said at the beginning, so I used to be a British civil servant, and there's this whole thing of like above my pay grade. And so these are the climate negotiations, but when the leaders are there, there's, the bigger picture going on in terms of the geopolitics. So a country might give something away that looks quite surprising, but you don't know sort of what bigger geopolitical side deals have gone on, and you may never know. And again, that can affect the verdict going in. So next slide, please, Cal. So the word salad, I've tried to distill into 3 components to make it a little bit easier to understand what we're hoping for at Glasgow. So we've come up with this concept called the Pact, and it stands for Promises, Ambition and Clean Transformation. And this is my easy way for my own sake to try and remember what it is we're trying to deliver. So promises, so lots of promises have been made on climate change. Some of them are decade and more old promises, including the promise from developed countries to developing countries to deliver $100 billion of climate finance a year from 2020. That sits in this sort of solidarity and prosperity type bucket between global north and global south. There have been lots of promises to talk about loss and damage and to begin a process that haven't been delivered on. What tends to happen is developing countries will say, we really want to talk about that, we want to have an agenda item on it, and the developed countries say, yes, 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 of course, but first we'll deal with our issue, and in the meantime, we'll just kick that into the long grass. And the problem is that we can't keep kicking it into the long grass because we're running out of time. So that's the promises part of it. The second part of what we're hoping for from Glasgow is more ambition. So an acceleration mechanism to keep 1.5 in sight. So I'm sure some of you know from the Paris Agreement, there is this thing called the review and ratchet mechanism, where countries come back with hopefully bigger and better promises in a cycle to ratchet up ambition and to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees, and with efforts to pursue 1.5. Since Paris, we can now see what the difference is of that half a degree, and therefore how pressing it is to have 1.5 as the goal. And we don't get there by having loads of net zero targets by 2050. We get there by having radical decarbonisation in the 2020s. So we need to see this acceleration mechanism. We need to see countries stepping up with their so-called nationally determined contributions, their NDCs. And we need ambition on nature, because there is no route to 1.5 that does not go right through nature. And we need, and we can geek out on this in the Q&A, we need the rule book and things around Article 6, closing in Article 6, basically market and non-market mechanisms, credit, swaps, that kind of thing. And then the last bucket is the clean transformation piece. So this is like all the deals, and I hate to quote him, but this is sort of the Boris Johnson coal, cars, cash, trees stuff. So this is all of the what's happening in the whole of society and real economy that demonstrates that the Paris Agreement is working, that people are hearing the signal and doing things. So whether it's fossil fuel subsidy phase out, whether it's ending coal, whether it's the US pledge around methane, forestry, energy transition. And when we get onto the cadence of the COP, what we're going to have is this world leaders segment at the beginning, where they're all going to come with this dreadful word, the announceables. So these are all like the big ticket, look at my big smashing pledge, my new initiative, my pet project. You'll hear a lot about that. And I would say, again, it's about the package. So none of these things on their own are enough. There has to be sort of a holistic approach to, did we get enough on keeping promises? Have we ratcheted up ambition? And what are the things in the business world, in cities and regions, individual country sector initiatives that we can point to that show the doing part of the climate action. So Kelly, if you want to jump 2 slides, because I think the next one just goes into a bit more detail, and I know we're short on time, so if you jump to slide 6, that would be great. So this is just to give you a heads up on sort of what the rhythm of the COP is. So you have the first 2 days, which is like all the leaders are there. It's the handshake, photograph moment. We're all on stage together. Aren't we fantastic? And what that will do is either provide lots of momentum or it will be really lackluster. And if it's lackluster, that's not great because it sets the tone for the rest of the fortnight, which then is, if it's a bit crap, then everybody is like lacking energy because the leaders haven't stepped up. So then the negotiations start in earnest on the Wednesday and the Thursday, and towards the end of the week, people start to get into panic mode where things aren't happening fast enough. We don't know what the shape of the package is going to look like. But don't worry, because Friday and Saturday, there'll be Fridays for Future March, and then on the Saturday, there'll be the Global Day of Action March, which will provide an outlet for the anger and the frustration, and it will also provide some big visuals for how much normal citizens around the world want climate action. And so that framing piece, you know, we can sort of beat leaders and negotiators over the head with, you know, look at everybody on the outside, this is what they want you to do. So technically, Sunday is a rest day. I assure you, nobody is resting, but that's what we're supposed to be doing. Get the Monday, it's a bit of a reset after the weekend. Ministers start to arrive to be fully embedded in the negotiations. Now, this is quite an interesting part of the COP. So if any of you have ever worked with ministers, they don't usually get into like the massive amount of detail that the climate negotiations require. So this is an unusual task for them. And some of them are better at it than others, but the idea is that, oh gosh, you know, the big boss has arrived and we've got to take it all very, very seriously, and we need to get down into the detail. You'll hear this phrase, nothing is agreed until everything is agreed, a lot around the Wednesday and the Thursday. What happens is the presidency, so Alok Sharma, will try and move the different tracks. So on finance, on 1.5, on adaptation, on loss and damage, on Article 6 together. Some bits go faster than others, but that's not ideal because it's got to be the package. So just because we're hearing progress on one bit doesn't mean that's what the rest of the package will look like. Thursday and Friday, more jeopardy, more panic. The negotiated outcomes aren't clear, they're not emerging. Everybody starts running around like headless chickens. Then everybody gets really tired. People sleep on the floor. The negotiators then drink lots of coffee and work overnight into the Saturday, and then hopefully there will be the gavel moment. Ta-da, we got an agreement, isn't it fantastic? And then that's when sort of the spin room starts, where everybody wants like quick, what's the verdict? What's it like? Where are the talking heads? Who are the influencers? And that's it in a nutshell. I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent, thanks for that. What I'll do right now is I'll take some quick questions. I want to go on to get into the issues very much so, but let's take some quick questions just on a bit of the schedule, or just any sort of, you know, technical questions. And I will, I'll stop sharing for a second, and then so I can see what's going on here. So do we have any questions there? And sorry, just go ahead and speak directly. Until I get rid of the screen, I can't see exactly what's going on. Any questions out there?
Okay, I do. That's okay, Cal.
Yeah, go for it. Sorry, I can't see much going on here.
Yeah, that's okay. No, I didn't. I just popped in because nobody was asking a question. So is there any indication of which leaders will not be there on the first day, and who to look for? And this aching thing in my head is the Queen is sick. So what if that goes sideways? Just wondering. I maybe shouldn't say it out loud, but anyway.
So honestly, Kathy, don't. We've with the partners that I work with said the Pope isn't coming, he's not well, the Queen is sick. Everybody is like, wrap David Attenborough up in cotton wool. Like, it's just, you know, it's not great that three of, you know, the global you know, supporters of climate action are all in their 90s. It's not ideal. Sorry, I'm not laughing. So I'm also at the slightly hysterical phase of the preparations for COP, so apologies if I keep giggling, but yeah, I think we're all like, oh no, here's our risk register of all of the things that could happen in the COP, and you know, that one is not a good one. Yeah, no, so actually it's always been a thing. So the British royal family speak quite strongly. So Prince Charles has a really strong track record. So he has this, I used to work for it, so the Prince of Wales Corporate Leaders Group at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Prince William and the Duchess of Cambridge are doing this Earthshot thing. They've always been very focused on sort of climate and conservation and that kind of thing. And I think some of the Queen's properties were like early renewable energy adopters and all this kind of thing. So, you know, and they're not the only royal family to do it. So I think the Dutch royal family, Prince Albert in Monaco's, you know, very outspoken about this. Yeah. So, you know, climate leadership comes in all different sorts of packages. In terms of like who's not going to be there, so I think it's pretty widely reported now that President Xi from China won't be there, and so there's been a whole lot of whataboutery. You know, the Chinese aren't coming, therefore what's the point? I think there are two schools of thought on this. So it's very likely that the Chinese are going to come up with their updated NDC today or tomorrow, and you know, we've already had this a 1+N package, which sort of alludes to what they might do to how they're going to implement their 2060 carbon neutrality target. And so sort of the climate hawks in the US are like, well, what about China? And then on the flip side, it's kind of like, well, when they come up with a plan, they will do the plan. When you come up with a number, you're not able to get it through Congress. So, you know, what would you rather have? Some big impressive numbers that you can't do anything about, or China coming with a concrete plan that you know damn fine they're going to overachieve? So is it more important that the leader turns up, or is it more important that they do the doing part of it? And I would say that we understand that they're going to be about like 13, 14, 15 cabinet secretaries coming from the US. And so to me, that feels slightly like slight overcompensation, perhaps. And again, it's sort of, are you all turning up with anything to do and say, or are you turning up because you feel bad that you had Trump and you weren't there for 5 years? So it's a bit of sort of 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. It's also unlikely that President Putin will be there. But to be honest, it's not like the Russians were terribly climate ambitious anyway. Australia are going after all, so I think quite a lot of pressure was put on the Australians, so that international peer pressure and multilateralism did work. Prime Minister Modi from India is going to be there, so perhaps, you know, India coming out from behind the shadow of China will be quite an interesting dynamic. But, you know, for all sorts of different reasons, leaders don't come. COVID adds an extra layer of complexity onto that. The numbers in Glasgow do not look good. You know, so there are lots of get out of jail free cards as to like why you wouldn't want to come. But I should point out as well that Xi isn't going to the G20 either. So, you know, it would be very nice if he was there, but better for the doing of it than the presenteeism.
And she apparently hasn't left China for the last 2 years, so it's
exactly.
not a normal. I want to move on now and get on to the details of the issues. And Sarah's going to stay with us, so we can come back to Sarah in the Q&A if that's all right. So I want to hand over to Anya, who's going to give us a bit of an overview of education. And do you want to pull up the PowerPoint straight away, Anya?
Yeah, thanks, Tel. That would be great. That's all right. It's a very short PowerPoint, like 3 slides. That's all right, guys. Yeah, so I'm Anya. I'm from the UK Committee for UNICEF, and I'm going to chat a little bit through education. So I've just started really quickly with why we're actually even talking about education at COP, appreciating that everything that Sarah went through is, you know, hugely important and the real focus of the event. So starting with what climate change can, as many of you know, increase disruption to education, uproot children, their families and communities, and impact educational opportunities that way. It often has gendered impacts, girls being likely to be pulled out of school first, And it can affect those with fewest financial resources the most. Either through children and young people not being able to afford school fees, or their families not being able to afford school fees, whether formal school fees or informal school fees, or having to be pulled out in order to support the family if their livelihood is destroyed. And we're seeing all of that impact children's education already, and only likely to increase. But conversely to that, education is a really important protective measure. It's protective, life-saving, and life-sustaining. I should say this paragraph comes from Send My Friend to School, so just to give them credit. It builds children's communities and communities' resilience and adaptive capacity. And to some degree in disasters, I think it's quoted as, it's what you know, not what you have. So children, young people, their families, their communities, knowing about climate change and knowing what to do in a disaster is really important and can be life-saving, and also supports their resilience. And finally, empowers children, young people to create a more sustainable future. And of course, children, young people don't necessarily need empowering, but it can support their knowledge around the issues, as well as sort of their rights. So their right to be heard and their right to information, knowledge of those rights is really important. But if we just move on to the next slide, I've pulled out a few education asks at COP, and I know a number of my colleagues are on the call now. I absolutely don't speak for everyone in the sector, but just giving a flavor of the kinds of things that education organizations are asking for ahead of COP. There's sort of two aspects of education, as you've already seen. So what in terms of our asks, so what happens in an education system. So that's things like the curriculum and teacher training, but also what happens to the education system. So resilience and disaster risk reduction, and building stronger education systems. So there's kind of two buckets of how you approach education. And within that, there's a few different themes. So things like youth leadership, again, empowering young people and ensuring they know their rights, but also that young people are a key part of climate education conversations, as they are already the leaders in this area. That's a big part of the ask. System strengthening for climate resilience, both in terms of kind of the actual infrastructure, but also the knowledge and the flexibility of education systems. The curriculum itself, ensuring that not just climate science is on the curriculum, but also climate justice. And in relation to that, gender justice, and ensuring we take a gender just approach to climate education. Gender just green learning, I think, is one of the phrases used, but definitely a kind of green learning agenda that supports gender justice. And finally, inclusive education, recognizing that climate education and systems affected by climate change need to make sure that they reach every learner, including learners with disabilities, who are so often left out of these conversations, and who are increasingly impacted by climate change. And within all of that, we also have the ACE negotiations, which are Action for Climate Empowerment. And that's the UNFCCC agenda that most directly relates to education. So the Doha work program expires this year, or expired last year, and will be renewed this year. So we'll have a new work program on what we'll be doing for ACE. And we're looking at influencing that, again, ensuring that these kinds of themes are included, and that it's a strong and ambitious ACE agenda. And so at the actual event itself, thanks, Kel, right on cue. The big education days are sort of the 5th, which is Youth and Public Empowerment Day. There's lots of education work happening there, and then the 9th for gender. And the 9th and Gender Day in education, it makes sense. It's the UK loves girls' education. That's kind of the link, I think. But on the 5th, there's a Climate and Education Ministers Summit in the late afternoon. It's co-chaired by the UK, Italy, mock COP, and with UNESCO. Countries have been invited to make written, video, or in-person pledges. And there'll also be a co-chair's statement coming out of that. I think it was going to be sort of a more formal thing, and now it's kind of gone down to a co-chair statement, but that will be published on the 5th, and that will relate to both areas of what happens in and to education systems. And that's led by the DFE in England, rather than the FCDO, in case that's helpful to know, so our domestic team. And then there's a wide range of blue and green zone events, including, just to flag 2, the FCDO-led ones, the UK-led ones, the Education Emergencies event on the 5th, and a Girls' Education event on the 9th. But there's loads of amazing events that so many organizations are kind of working on. And throughout all of this, there's also behind-the-scenes ACE negotiations, and yeah, lots of other educational opportunities going on throughout. So hopefully that's a kind of quick overview, but yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions, and I'm sure colleagues on the call as well could add. I'm sure I've missed things. Thanks.
Great. What I want to do now is go directly to Melanie. I want to keep on with the cadescence of ourselves here, if that's okay, and we'll come back to some questions to Anya or colleagues from the education sector who want to make a contribution. Melanie, are you there?
I am ready. Hello.
I'm going to see if I can get your thing up, but strangest feeling, I have to go over here, start talking, and I'm going to pull up your PowerPoint.
I'll start by introducing Action for Global Health, but thank you, Kel, for inviting us to speak today. So just to introduce Action for Global Health, or AFGH for ease, we're a UK-based network of more than 50 organisations working across the world where the universal right to health is realised without actually impoverishing people further. And we also act as a coordinator between the UK government and global health civil society. We have recently been advocating on the connections between climate change and global health, and we will be at COP as well, particularly in the Green Zone, and we'll be sharing a space with a range of other organisations, including Students for Global Health, the Health and Climate Network, who also have a wide series of briefings on health as well, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Clean End Fund, Action Against Hunger, and so forth. So if you are around, please do drop by. What I'm here to talk to you about a little bit, and there are a few slides, but don't worry, I'm just going to kind of talk through them quite hopefully rapidly. So what I'm here to talk to you a little bit about our AFGH position paper on climate change and global health inequalities in particular. And this report really is about providing the background to climate change and global health and making the connections between the two. And it also puts forward a set of kind of broad recommendations that governments, global governments, should really consider to tackle the impact of climate change and on global health inequalities. If you can just pop to the next slide, please, Kel. Just a quick overview of the impacts of climate change on health inequalities. It's always important to sort of remember, I think, that climate change is a threat multiplier, which means that it's exacerbating existing threats and existing inequalities, but it's also creating new inequalities. And I think, health impacts are really a function of exposure and vulnerability, with exposure being sort of related to the frequency and severity of an event, a climate change event, and vulnerability really reflecting a person's ability to anticipate, resist, respond, and really cope with that event in overall. And again, another thing is I always think it's really important to note, and I think it's quite widely known, that exposure and vulnerability are highest in lower middle income countries, so countries in the global south. But these countries also produce the least emissions. And then conversely, countries like the UK and high income countries, so wealthier countries, emit around 86% of global carbon dioxide emissions. But we also have the least exposure to climate change impact. And then again, conversely, the greatest ability to adapt, because we do have more money, quite frankly. And then at the country level, I think you can probably go to the next slide. I think at the country level, we see people of low socioeconomic status are more exposed and more vulnerable as well. So there's extra layer of vulnerability and exposure there. For example, elders and children are far less able to respond and protect themselves from immediate hazards. Elders and those with pre-existing health conditions are especially vulnerable to the health impacts of heat, for example. And again, different genders are differently vulnerable to climate impacts due to their gendered roles, different living and working conditions, and different social expectations. And then, of course, people with lower incomes typically live in poorer housing, in much more vulnerable areas. They work outdoors, and this leaves them more exposed to the impacts of heat and flooding and storm and vector-borne diseases such as malaria and so forth. And then just, on this slide that you see up here, the sort of under the causes of climate change, food and agriculture, energy and transport, these are some of the account for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions globally. And you can see that greenhouse gas causes increases in temperatures, increases in and changes in precipitation and changes weather patterns, and creates things like floods and storms and sea level rises. And these have direct impact on health in terms of respiratory conditions, vector-borne diseases like malaria, dengue fever, and so forth, and also like waterborne diseases and cholera. And also, not to forget, the mental health impacts of this as well, where, not just the stress and anxiety of impending climate crisis, but the responses and stress to the injury that you befall and so forth. So I think if you can pop to the next slide, please, Kel, thank you. And I think one of the key areas that healthcare that Action for Global Health advocates for is health coverage for all, which is really around universal health coverage. And climate change impacts the three areas of universal health coverage in terms of people in need of care, the coverage of people in care, the cost of treatment, and the care services available. So just to briefly reference back to the previous slide a little bit, the increased burden of existing diseases such as rainfall patterns changing and flooding in new areas, bringing with it mosquitoes who then bring Zika or dengue fever. This is bringing in new diseases into areas that hadn't previously seen this, which is creating higher demand for healthcare services, and is also causing disruption to hospital. And also there's also usually a massive gap in need of necessary expertise because it wasn't widely available, it wasn't widely needed in that area. And then, of course, another impact of the damage that climate change has to healthcare is around healthcare facilities, damage to healthcare facilities due to flooding or storms, meaning that communities will be unable to access the healthcare facilities and so forth, and meaning that even basic medicines and therapies may become unavailable. And then I think if we could pop to the next slide, I think it's quite clear, that, I've just referenced just a few of the health impacts of climate change, but there's such a wide sector, and I could talk about it literally for hours, in all the details of the specific diseases and so forth. But I think it's, it is quite clear that we do need to address and respond to climate change in order to reduce the health inequalities. And this report actually does, provide a set of recommendations that urges interventions across the main carbon producing sectors, such as energy, transport, food and agriculture. And then beyond the health sector as well, we need to support the infrastructure project to protect health as well, to ensure clean water, safe housing, maintenance of roads, and so on. And just very briefly across those main sectors, in terms of energy use, energy use in buildings and industry accounts for more than half of the greenhouse gas emissions. So what we need to look into is really, supporting sustainable electricity and technologies in order to reduce these emissions and enable health benefits. And this includes within the health sector themselves. Health sectors also have a certain responsibility for reducing their emissions too, even though it is smaller than other areas. But practice what we preach is quite important. I think moving to food and agricultural methods contribute to climate change and really impact health. For example, agricultural methods really account for around 20% of greenhouse gas emissions, with many of the products least beneficial for human health also having the highest carbon footprints, like red meat and processed foods and so forth. And in addition, climate change is reducing dietary diversity and is increasing cases of malnutrition, particularly around children. So we need to think of ways of combating this in order to promote, and one of those recommendations that we put forward is around promoting locally sourced diets, rich in whole grains and vegetables, low in red meat, and really reducing processed products and using climate sustainable agricultural methods. And then just finally, in terms of transport, and transport accounts for about 12% of greenhouse gases. we have to remember transport systems are really created to support motorised vehicles rather than active and public transport. So I think, it's really helpful to have an investment in walking and cycling and public transport infrastructure in order to both climate change. And of course, there's the immediate benefits to health there in terms of physical exercise and so forth. So I think if you can pop to the next slide, please, just one of the last kind of couple of comments to make, really. I think, this is a little bit similar to the previous kind of figure that I showed quite quickly earlier on. But I think, we can see that some of the health benefits that I've just kind of really outlined here, if we make the changes to food and agriculture, energy and transport that I've suggested, we're going to end up with cleaner air, healthier diets, increased physical activity, which will have a direct impact on the decreases of lung cancer, decreases in stress, decreases in malaria and so forth. So I think there is a win-win, basically, is what I'm trying to say, to the changes of climate change across for many people. And then very finally, next stage, please, Kel. I think as well as the need to sort of make these changes across the industries as well as the health sectors themselves, I think we really need to take a multi-layered approach to consider the need for health system strengthening and wider infrastructure strengthening via an inclusive approach that really ensures meaningful participation of those most affected by the impacts of climate change. And this is at all levels of research and decision making. And that's really to ensure that we kind of create long-lasting action, positive action on climate change, and really ensure universal health coverage for all. I mean, those affected really do experience multiple intersecting forms of oppression and disadvantage, and they really do know best. So the next slide is just the set of recommendations there, which I won't go through, but if we're going to share the slides, it's just handy for you to have. I've pretty much talked through them rather broadly. But yeah, I hope that was a helpful overview to climate change and health. And yeah, if you have any questions, please do shout.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Hold your questions. You can throw them in the chat, but hold your questions and we'll go straight to Chiara, who is going to talk about human rights in climate. Passing over.
Thank you so much, Kel and everybody. So I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm just going to chat through a few points, mostly why COP is important from a human rights perspective and what is Amnesty priority for the COP. So first of all, it's necessary to say why climate change matters for human rights. And actually, the thing is, climate change is becoming an unprecedented human rights crisis because it is impacting on the majority of our rights. And I think Melanie and Anya have already made the case for how it impacts on the right to health and the right to education, but also right to life. For example, like all the people who are killed in climate-related disasters, right to housing, right not to be forcibly displaced, and the list can go really, because of all the implications with that, there are also impacts on civil and political rights and so on. And so first of all, I think there are, at this COP, from a human rights perspective, there are 3 areas, and this reflects what Sarah already highlighted, that are relevant for human rights. And one is the issue of ambition on emission reductions. And this is important from the human rights perspective because obviously we really must keep global warming within 1.5 degrees of increase to avoid the worst human rights impacts. And the scientists have told us, the IPCC, so there is no doubt about that. And there are a couple of opportunities to kind of increase this. So at this COP, you have, as Sarah was mentioning, the review of national pledges, the national determined contributions, and negotiations on carbon markets. And these are, so it's important that out of these negotiations, we come out with stronger and more ambitious emission reduction targets for 2030, because at the moment they are still leading us to a global warming of 2.7 degrees. And pledges for long-term strategies for emission reductions that are actually based on reducing absolute emissions and phasing out fossil fuels. So, but not just talking about net zero in 2050, which is quite too late and too little, and relies a lot on offsetting projects that could delay climate action and have important human rights consequences for people on the ground. For example, lots of offsetting projects have resulted in human rights violations of indigenous peoples and so on. And so it is important that these negotiations on Article 6, which is the article of the Paris Agreement that deals with the carbon markets issue, the rules that needs to be agreed needs to be robust in the sense that needs to lead to genuine emission reductions, but also includes human rights safeguards. So, for example, the obligation to consult with people affected and respect the right of indigenous peoples to prior free and informed consent, for example. Also, the second pillar, it's again, as Sarah mentioned, the issues related with international cooperation and assistance. So states, wealthier states have the responsibility, have the obligation under human rights law to provide support and cooperation and assistance to less wealthy countries to actually allow, help them meeting adequate standards for the respect and fulfillment of human rights. And so in this case, states, really wealthier states, really need to come up with stronger commitments that actually satisfy the needs for climate action in developing countries. But also the issue of loss and damage is quite crucial from a human rights perspective because it reflects the obligation of states who have contributed the most to the climate crisis to actually provide remedy to those who are suffering human rights violations. And so this is why it's important that there is some sort of global mechanism to provide additional finance to people affected by loss and damage in poorer countries. And these finance need to be additional, as I said, but also mostly based on loans and not just on, on grants and not just on loans, as it is happening at the moment. And then the third pillar, I would say that is really crucial from a human rights perspective is, again, what I think Anya already mentioned, is related to climate information, education, and public participation. These are important elements to ensure effective climate action. These are also human rights obligations that states have to ensure that people are informed about the state of the climate and any climate action that they are planning, but also that people can actually participate in these decisions. And so we have this opportunity of the review of the Action for Climate Empowerment work program that has been done before COP, and the opportunity to renew this work program. And so the demand here is really that a new Action for Climate Empowerment work program should be adopted, but this time it should be strengthened and anchored in human rights standards and principles and obligations of states, so that they can actually deliver on these principles and ensure that actually at national level and international level there are enough opportunities and genuine opportunities for people to participate in climate decision making. And yeah, I'm going to stop here because I know we are short on time, and
excellent. Thank you very much. That excellent overview of the right situation. Let's move straight into some questions. And Barbara, you have asked one in the chat, and would you want to ask it live? Are you there, Barbara?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. Okay. I don't think I can turn on my video, but at least you can hear me. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the floor, and thank you for the presenters. Very informative. So I'm with the Scaling Up Nutrition Movement. We're a consortium of UN agencies, NGOs, private sector, and donors, organizations working on nutrition issues. And we're quite new to this climate change arena. And I was in Madrid in 2019 and was quite shocked, to be honest, by the low level of visibility for nutrition and food. And I was really happy to see Melanie mentioning the food and agriculture sector as one of the main emitters and one of the main contributors, and also of climate change and being impacted by climate change. So we have done our homework and sort of understood better the interlinkages and then made that visible. But my question is around the next steps, and apologies if this is quite naive, but I'm wondering, at what level of governments should we reach out to have an influence on the NDCs, and is there any space at all to influence the content of the NDCs with regards to food and nutrition? And yeah, how does it work to get this to the other level, to the next level, let's say? Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Does anybody want to take a stab at that? NDCs, how do you influence them? We know a lot of countries have done NDCs for this COP, but do they do them annually, or is it every 5 years? Sarah, do you want to take a shot at this?
Yeah, sure, I'll have a go. So there is guidance in the Paris Agreement about so there is a so-called review and ratchet process in the Paris Agreement, and it's supposed to be on a 5-year cycle. And this is what I was talking about in terms of the acceleration mechanism. So this is supposed to be the start of the review and ratchet process, which is why there have been lots of deadlines last year and all through this year for countries to come forward with either a restatement or a recommitment or a ratchet of their NDC. A lot of those deadlines have, the sound of deadlines whistling by has been a bit of a feature. And I think there's a recognition that the ratchet process on a 5-year cycle probably isn't going to be enough to keep us in line with 1.5. So a lot of different countries are saying, and there's nothing to stop any country updating its NDC as often as it wants. It's not prescriptive in the Paris Agreement. In fact, there's a specific clause, and I can't remember the article number exactly, but there's a specific clause that says crack on, whenever you like. How do you go about influencing NDCs is something quite different. Sorry, can you turn that off? Sorry, it's half term. Good fun. How do you go about influencing countries and their NDCs? Well, it's sort of classic lobbying tactics. So finding the right people in the government to go and talk to, and of course the preparation for an NDC. If it's an economy-wide NDC, my goodness, you could be talking about a dozen different departments who are going to be feeding in. And I think Melanie's presentation about sort of climate and health co-benefits demonstrate all the interlinkages. So you could be talking to the health department about, healthy lifestyles. You could be talking to the transport department about active transport. You could be talking to the Environment Department about forestry and agriculture and land use. You could be talking to the Business Department about energy efficiency measures. So the world is your oyster almost. And it's kind of, you will know your geography better. You will know where, the particular politicians with particular pet interests, or, it may be a constituency interest, and therefore you might want to push on that. It might be a particular lobby group that they get motivated by. It might be a particular trade association, it might be a particular sector. So it literally is, it's the full suite of lobby activity that you could crack on with. So yeah, and it's all the time, everywhere. They can do it whenever they want. There are specific moments. The COP is providing a specific filtering moment for a lot of lobby activity. A lot of it is international peer pressure. So, for example, the Australians have felt the need to come forward with a net zero plan in whatever vague, loose terms that's going to be, and so is Saudi Arabia. So a lot of it might come from the big geopolitical movements and the moments, whether it's G7, G20, a health conference, a conservation conference. Like, there are so many in and entry points. It's kind of like of your own making almost.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Sarah. Does anybody, Melanie, Shara, or Aya, do you have any sort of examples where you guys have done something well in getting something in NCDs? You want to quickly share this?
I mean, I can come in generally. Because we're a coalition, we have to kind of advocate at a certain level. But just to just kind of ratify what Sarah said, the world is our oyster at the moment for Action for Global Health in terms of who we're looking to influence, but we are looking to influence really. I like the term international peer pressure, so I'm going to steal that in future. But we are looking at that. We are looking because it does have an effect. And we have found as well that working one-on-one and seeking out those key targets within the sort of governments that you're looking at within those departments and those varied departments is really important. And particularly because what I'm trying to do is, connect those linkages between climate change and health. But also I think the public does have a part to play in it as well. And I found from a UK perspective, because Action for Global Health leverages really the UK's responsibility in climate change and global health generally, but we leverage all these different angles. But we have found that the public pressure does make a difference to what the UK government does. I mean, it's not a kind of magic bullet. But yeah, Barbara, I'd be happy to speak offline and sort of share learnings. And I think actually that on that point, it's really important to just talk to each other and talk to other CSOs and come together, because that's really strong as well. But yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Are there other questions out there? Anybody has something else they want to, either you can ask in the chat or just raise your hand. I think I can see if you raise your hand. With the hand up, and Kathy.
Well, thank you for this snapshot of everything. I do focus on climate, but human rights and children and health and food and everything is intertwined with that. So I am being selfish right now. My husband is a medical doctor and he works quite hard on reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the OR. So any sort of connections he could make at COP26, he works at anyway, would be great. So he could give us an indication of where he could go there. And I'm also bringing my 14-year-old daughter. So if there's anything that you think I should bring her to just to watch, to be inspired, I would love that. So I'm being utterly selfish right now. I hope that was okay, Cal.
That's fine. Let's reframe it. What are the practical engagements that you can undertake at COP? And again, I might go to you, Sarah. I know there's blue zones and green zones. I know that all the passes are kind of gone. I don't know if you've passed already, Kathy, but do you want to just give us a bit of overview?
Sure. So there's something called the Green Zone, which is open to the public. So if you just Google Green Zone COP26, there'll be a whole program of stuff. It is open. You don't need a special badge, but you do need a ticket so that they know how many people are going in and out for COVID safety reasons. I think they're releasing more tickets on Sunday, so just go and have a look, because at the moment it looks like all the sessions are full, but they're not. They're just staggering the ticket availability. You might want to have a look on the COP26 coalition website. They've got a whole raft of sort of community-based events happening throughout Glasgow. And a lot of that is around sort of intersectionality between, the different sort of climate justice, gender, public health. And I think there'll be some really exciting sessions there. In terms of the blue zone, you do need a badge. If you haven't got one, you're not going to get one now. Sorry about that, but that tends to be the negotiations and not terribly thrilling unless you're a negotiations spotter, which I am, so I love it. And I think there's a whole load of sort of cultural events happening. If you have a look on the sort of Glasgow City Council website, there's a lot of sort of local events going on as well. But I think just to highlight what other colleagues have said, I think there are quite a lot of health events. I think, from my own experience of working with sort of some of the businesses who are claiming to be sort of green and progressive and all of that kind of thing, they are looking at, how they can cut carbon emissions throughout the supply chain, and whether it's medical, whether it's sort of the way that they're producing their drugs, whether it's how they're transporting things. So a lot of the folks in the health sector, be it the pharma companies, they are across this. So I think like, for example, GSK is one of the main sponsors of COP26, for example. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'm gonna call it there. I just want to say a couple things in conclusion. I will be putting the recording of this webinar and the links. For example, Jared's put in the Amnesty report and some links there. I'll have them on whatworldassembly.com. I put it in the chat, but it's whatworldassembly, all one word.com. And we're putting it there. The other thing I'm putting together is a grid of what I'm calling non-climate asks or climate plus asks. So I've put together, I think, 250 different asks coming across education, health, rights, gender. They're all gonna be in one place. The link will be on that page. I would share my screen now, share it, but we don't have time. But if you do have asks, or do you have policy papers that you don't see there, or you want to send them to me, please do that, because I will kind of looking to get a comprehensive one. And I'm really curious in post-COP, the Assembly, the Work Assembly coming back, and maybe doing some sort of teach-ins on how to influence entities. How do you, climate, as we know, is not going away. Next year is going to be a really important year in 2022. I think next year we'll be looking at health, education, climate, and really seeing it holistically. So some sessions on how to influence the NDCs, how to influence the climate agenda from these different perspectives, and vice versa. I think there's going to be a lot of cross-pollination, and hopefully that will be interest to people post-COP, when we all have a moment to catch our breath. But in the meantime, I'd really like to thank Melanie, Jara, Anya, and Sarah for your fantastic contributions. I thank you all for attending and coming along, given it's so busy. And I really appreciate your time, and good luck for everyone who's going to COP. Hope it goes well.